real stories of werewolves, of Dogman history, from your emails, illustrated and animated with the democratizing magic of machine learning AI. Welcome to Scary Stories.
Dogman versus Lizardman. Dear Scary Stories NYC. First of all, I want to say right off the bat that if you're in the camp that believes that Dogman is an animal like a bear or a wolf, and that eventually it will be known by science, then I don't think you'll like my story. If you've got a wider opened mind and you can take a story at face value, then what happened to me might open your eyes. That's because way back in 1989, I myself witnessed a UFO in Florida. Following that UFO in my 1979 Fiat Spider convertible, my girlfriend and I had our creepy encounter with both Dogman and what I can only presume was either a reptilian or Lizardman. I'm pretty sure those things aren't normal natural Earth creatures, and I'll try to convince you of the same as I tell you about what happened to us. So, I was there with my girlfriend Dora, not her real name, and we were parked in the middle of nowhere by some palm trees watching the lizards run up and down them. Forests up north are inviting patches of natural wonder, but down in Florida, they're impenetrable and frightening patches of jungle instead. She wasn't finding our location very romantic and asked me to at least put up the roof so that she didn't feel so exposed. She told me that she was afraid one of the lizards were going to climb in, and the one thing in the world she was most creeped out by was lizards. I figured this lover's lane wasn't doing its job, so I pulled out of there and we cruised for a while, looking for another location that would be as private but less creepy. Dora leaned against my shoulder, smiling, glad to be out of the dark jungle. Soon, she seemed to have fallen asleep, but I just kept driving and looking for a better place to park. I remember we were up by Weston and I decided to drive north of there and see what I could find. I'm guessing we were on Route 27, because when I look at Google Maps, that's basically the way I remember the road looking, except it was dark and lonely, with nobody else around. I guess there's not much to drive to up there in the middle of the night. The road is just 2 lanes going one way and 2 going the other, but the interesting thing about Route 27 is that it's built upon a series of islands. What I mean is, it has a canal of water to the left of it and a canal of water to the right, with a big old patch of grass in between the 2 roads. Sometimes the water from the left side and the right side meet underneath and you go on a bridge over it. Like I said, a series of islands. If you use any images from Google Maps or Google Earth when you're showing this story, please make sure to tell your audience that this happened at night. In the daytime Google Maps images, it looks like a nice and sunny fun place to be. That night we were there, I was starting to get creeped out, driving there with no lights except for the stars and my headlights. I had already begun looking out for a legal way to make a U-turn and head back south where it's far more civilized. That's when the lights came by for the first time, or at least that's when I noticed them. At first I thought I was seeing light reflecting off the inside of the passenger seat window past my sleeping girlfriend Dora. I was trying to steal glances in that direction while driving, but it was kind of hard. It seemed to me that there was something strange out there, lit up in the night sky, but it didn't move in any normal kind of way. It always seemed to move up and down as though it were on a flat surface, not in 3-dimensional space, if that makes any sense at all. I was thinking it can't be an object in space. It has to be a stationary lit-up object on my left, being reflected onto the glass, bumping up and down on the road to my right. But there was absolutely nothing to my left that was lit up at all. It was just land and trees and palm trees and water and grass and more land. I began looking inside the car to see if something were reflecting off the dashboard, but there wasn't any kind of light that looked anything like what I kept seeing. or at least what I kept thinking I was seeing, out the window to my right. Eventually, I woke Dora up and I asked her to look out there for me. She soon started making noises that kind of worried me. I didn't know exactly what they meant, but I knew they were not happy noises. "It's a tricky looky," she said, which was what her family called optical illusions. I asked her what the trick was, and she said she couldn't tell yet, but it couldn't be real. It was moving around like a squiggle, and it was moving too fast to be a helicopter or a plane. She started putting forth a theory that maybe it wasn't moving. Maybe it was because we were moving. And then her voice trailed off, and soon neither of us was saying anything at all. After about a minute of silence, I asked Dora for an updated report on the strange lights. This time she sounded dreamy. "It's beautiful," she told me in a dazed-sounding voice. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." That was about all I could take, so since there was no traffic, I pulled the car to the right and parked. Grabbing my old mini binoculars out of the glove compartment, I stood outside the driver's seat door, leaning my chest against the car and studying the strange lights in the sky as best as I could. Whatever it was, either was able to alter its shape or else move so quickly as to leave colored trails behind it, providing the illusion of a constantly changing shape. It was often red, sometimes a yellowish white, and would produce small lights of greenish and bluish tones that would burst out of it and seemingly fade out. It looked like a living sparkler in the sky, a never-ending intelligent firework. It truly was beautiful, but it was also hypnotic, and it was starting to do things that just seemed completely impossible. I don't even know how to describe it, just things that it shouldn't have been able to do. Feeling a growing sense of fear, I jumped back in the car, drove left across the grass to the highway on the other side, and started driving us back toward home. Now the weird light was on my side, and I struggled with all my focus and concentration not to look at it even peripherally. Dora was shouting out a play-by-play to my right, telling me what it was doing and how its appearance was continually changing. Eventually, she told me that it looked like it was landing. And for some reason, I felt a lot more frightened upon hearing that. I remember hitting the gas and speeding up, but I don't remember us getting very far before I had to slow the car down and stop, idling there, in the middle of the road, out there in the night, lit up by my headlights. In between us and home were two very strange and impossible creatures, both apparently outcasts from a Ray Harryhausen picture, taking up the entire road, with a battle straight out of ancient mythology. Now, before I describe this, I want to say that these events don't occur in a vacuum. This fight that I'm about to describe led to Dora becoming obsessed with all this David Icke stuff a few years afterward. I'm not going to diss you if that's your thing, but Dora went overboard, and she drowned in it. It's not exactly what led to our breakup later in the 90s, but it certainly didn't help anything. And this is all because she became convinced that what we were witnessing was a battle between a reptilian and some other hairy alien creature. I don't know if she's still going on about that stuff these days because we aren't in touch, and I deliberately quit social media back in 2017. I got sick of seeing how crazy people that I used to respect had become, Dora included. If I hadn't randomly chosen to drive north into an area I was unfamiliar with that night, Dora and I might have gotten married. We might be sitting together tonight, instead of me typing this story down for you. I think it's my only true regret in life, that I drove north that night, instead of turning around and driving the sleeping girl home. I was a young man, and I wanted her attention. I placed my own happiness first, and in that case, it led to us seeing this traumatic thing that scarred and changed both of us. The two man-things in front of us were larger than life. They were like Jack Kirby versions of a Lizardman and a dog-headed man. They were so tall it was absurd. I don't mean Godzilla tall, but I do mean something like 13 or 14 feet tall. Dora's father told both of us that we saw two guys wearing Halloween costumes, and we had to laugh at him. These were twice the size of men, and it would have been impossible for a human to operate a puppet that large either. Imagine the exoskeleton in that Aliens picture. That was the size of each of these creatures. I'm not trying to say they appeared mechanical or as though they were operated via hydraulics. They looked and moved like giant-sized living creatures. You could sort of say it looked like special effects monsters in real life, but even that is sort of not true, because this was so much more real. It was certainly a tricky looky of some sort. I know that something real was happening on the road in front of us, and yet I also feel positive that it wasn't exactly what we were thinking that we were seeing. I'm really not sure what I even mean by that, but both of the animals did little tiny things that made them seem impossible to me. Things that were just a little bit off, and I felt just a little bit as though my consciousness were not in the normal frequency. This might be the Oz effect that I've read about, but I don't know. I have a deep suspicion that there was more going on that night than we could view with our eyes or hear with our ears. Maybe I mean that there were more dimensions in that moment than the ones we're used to. You could tell that things weren't normal. You could feel it in every cell of your body. My hair stood on end, and it was both terrifying and exciting simultaneously. If I lived through this, I knew I was going to miss that intense feeling. And yet, it was so horrible to endure. I wanted it to stop the entire time. The one creature was in earth tones of browns and blacks with white teeth flashing as he snapped repeatedly, trying to bite a big chunk out of the reptile man. The hairy thing resembled a wolf more than anything else, although it stood up on two very massive hind legs, the size of tree trunks. They looked like they could support a house, and the wolfman was able to maneuver quickly in battle on those mighty appendages. He, and I'm certain he was a male, had large hand-like paws at the end of its front legs or arms, and each of the fingers ended in a remarkably long talon, possibly even longer than its teeth. It did not use these paws or claws for attack, though, at least not in my presence. It would defend using its front legs or arms, but when attacking, it seemed monomaniacally only interested in snapping at the lizard, attempting to bite him. The hairy mammalian-looking monster's opponent had grayish, scaly skin. Dora says it was green skin, but if so, it was a dull and grayish green. It was roughly proportioned like a very tall man, but it was not human in any way. Rather than a wolf or canine head, this one had the head you would expect, the head that Jack Kirby would have drawn on him in a Marvel comic book. In fact, to compare this creature to the Lizardman from Spider-Man comics would not be an outlandish thing to do. He wasn't wearing a torn white lab coat, but you get my point. Doris started screaming that they were aliens or something like that. She was saying they were from the UFO, but to be honest, I don't know for a fact that the lights we saw were from a UFO or a craft. They might have been some kind of a light show designed to hypnotize us to see those monsters fighting. After all, I don't really know if any or all of this really happened, in the normal sense of the term, happened. Doris is certain that she knows what happened, but even now, all these years later, I can only guess. If we did hallucinate what we saw, we both hallucinated the same thing. She and I both saw what looked like men with animal heads battling on the road a few minutes after we saw strange lights in the sky. I tend to agree with her that the lights must have probably had something to do with the Dogman and the Lizardman, but I can't prove that, and the two might have been unrelated to each other, as unlikely as that seems to me personally. It was after some time of the two of us sitting there like couch potatoes watching my three sons when it dawned on me that we were both acting sort of strange. Why wasn't I driving away? Nothing was stopping me from making a U-turn. Then again, I'd only be heading back north then, and up north from there. There's a whole lot of scary nothing. I began to notice the rhythm of the battling. It was almost hypnotic in and of itself. The Dogman would make an advance, snapping at the throat of the Lizardman, who would retreat and back up toward the other highway. Then, the lizard would begin swiping at the dog with his deadly-looking claws, and the Dogman would leap backward, entirely blocking the road in front of us. Rather than allowing myself to continue to be lulled to sleep by the back-and-forth motion, I used it to focus my attention more strongly. When the two beasts charged to the right, I floored the gas, charging forward in their direction and causing Dora to let out a frightened squeal. I hadn't lost my mind, though, quite the opposite. I swerved left as the monsters charged right, and I drove across that grass divider toward the other side of the highway. Reaching the blacktop, I skidded to the right, knowing I was now heading in the direction of oncoming traffic. If I hadn't known it already, Dora screamed it loudly into my ear. I wasn't concerned about that, though. There was no traffic for as far as the eye could see. I only thought about one single thing. Am I going to get past these two monsters fighting to my right before they stumble and roll back in this direction and crush us? Well, sadly, the monsters landed on top of us and we perished on that night. Oh no, wait, we got through and lived to tell the tale. I got us both home safely, but neither of us was ever really the same person again that we had been before. Over the years, every time I think I've got everything figured out in life, I remember Dora thinking she had everything figured out about the two monsters and the strange lights in the night sky. To her, these were two warring alien species, battling it out on Earth like something from Star Trek or whatever. Her interpretation is 100% like something out of science fiction, if you ask me. But I'm not saying I know enough to prove her wrong. She thinks the lizard people are the real rulers of Earth, and I forget what she thinks the Dogmen are. She lectured me one night on how many different alien species are on Earth, and when she was done, I reminded her that she forgot to include Alf. Also, Gazoo from the Flintstones, can't forget him. Honestly, I'm not against the idea of aliens. I'm just against the idea of jumping to conclusions that something is alien when we really don't know. I am increasingly enamored of the concept that the lights were a device used to brainwash or hypnotize us, and that possibly the fight itself may have been another hypnosis device. After all, it had such a rhythmic nature to it. When I pulled past the monsters making our escape, Dora actually asked me why I did that. She had been content, sitting there staring dumbly at the monsters fighting. She had stopped questioning it entirely. When others stop questioning and start accepting, that makes alarm bells go off inside me and I start to get very suspicious. Could what happened to us have been an experiment of some kind? Could it have been carried out by either military or else private interests who were developing this strange technology, possibly for military uses? Could it have been a PSYOPs experiment to see how people might react to it, so that it could be deployed against our country's enemies? Could it be that we haven't heard much more about this sort of thing happening again because our reactions weren't what they had hoped? After all, I figured out a way to get out of there. I escaped whatever hold they were trying to have over us, assuming that my idea is correct and that this was all somehow not exactly really happening. Dora and I both saw the same thing as each other, and yet we both have completely different ideas about what it was that we actually experienced. She and I tell completely different stories, but both versions have the same title, which is Dogman versus Lizardman. We'd like to thank this episode's executive producer, Ron Barracuda. His name is Barracuda. More hits than Lucas Duda. He's wiser than a Buddha. His name is Barracuda. Please join me in thanking Ron Barracuda for making this episode possible. Rumble in Humble. Dogman versus Dogman battle in Texas. Dear Scary Stories NYC. This is the craziest thing that happened to me in my life, and the scariest too. I feel like I can't leave out the word surprising as well. It happened one night about 3 weeks ago when I was driving home on Townsend Boulevard. It was in that area on the north end of Humboldt, Texas, which passes through some pretty heavily wooded spots. I know the title of this story announces a heavyweight title bout, but the way the situation started, it was sort of your more typical giant dog-headed monster encounter, if there is such a thing. I was just driving and minding my business, and then this big, grayish-colored, giant, hairy man was coming out of the woods. Have you ever seen a man with a dog's head before? The first time you see one, it sends your brain scrambling to figure out how your eyes could have gotten it so wrong. I mean, you just can't believe what you're seeing. It's so impossible looking. And this one wasn't just impossible looking. He seemed fierce and deadly, like I was about to meet my maker. I instantly went from thinking about my dinner to accepting my doom upon seeing this monster dogman creature, which must have been 9 feet tall or taller. This thing walked right out onto the road, like that was what a giant dog monster was supposed to do. I stopped moving as though I had been frozen from the inside, and I felt cramped with pain. This was the kind of thing that happened in the movies, not in real life. It happened when you were watching Roku at home in your socks. A monster? A monster was something for you to judge and laugh at dismissively. Ha! A monster? That looks so fake. Monsters make us feel safe. They make us feel powerful. In videos and movies, I mean. In real life, as I learned, they can have exactly the opposite effect. That's why I felt sick. It seemed so unfair. This monster was bigger than my car. This monster could reach in and pull me out of my seat as though we were playing Grand Theft Auto. This was like a hairy, dog-headed version of the Hulk. I don't mean it was green. I mean it was big and nasty. And it couldn't have possibly been there. Even the way it was lit up by my headlights terrified me. It looked so real, like something out of a documentary. And yet, it was a giant werewolf. I had no choice but to hit the brakes and try not to run into it. I knew a crash would wreck my front end, but I'm not sure it would have even hurt the creature at all. While I was slowing the car down and trying to come to a full stop, I was looking at the hulking dogman in front of me. I was experiencing anguish of all sorts, as well as negative physical stress reactions. But this dogman hadn't even noticed me approaching yet. Or maybe that's around when he began to notice the headlights, or maybe the screeching squeal of my tires. As I came to a full stop, I had my eyes shut. I was so afraid to see what was going to happen. I literally didn't. Look, that is. But after the car came to a halt, I hadn't heard a thump, and I hadn't felt one either. Cautiously opening my eyes, I looked out my front windshield and a huge dog head was baring its fangs and barking at me in a most harsh manner. I sunk down in the driver's seat as low as I could go, crying uncontrollably. I felt as though this was it. This was my final chapter. Some people say that they saw their life pass in front of them when they thought they were going to meet their maker. With me, I heard the song My Way, as sung by Frank Sinatra at first, but it became Elvis before the end. I cried as I got ready to leave this world for whatever comes next. After a while, though, I noticed I was still alive, and I noticed that the dogman wasn't barking at me anymore. I could feel the ground shaking, and I knew something terrible was happening. Curiosity overcoming me, I opened my eyes and looked around in time to see that the great beast was now preoccupied with a very different set of issues entirely. It's a little hard to explain this next part, because it was like turning on a stream of an old horror movie 35 minutes into the film. There wasn't just the one monster anymore, there were two of them. I think they were both the same kind of monster, but they were different colors from each other. I could tell which one was the one that had terrified me already because his fur was grayish. The other one, the new one, had reddish-brownish fur instead, and his ears were different. The gray one had a wolf-like head, but the brown one's head was more dog-like, and the ears were somewhat larger and floppier. It had a wider muzzle than the wolf-like one, and its belly fur was a lighter color too. Both of them were around the same size, I would say. Maybe they were from the same species, but different tribes? The two beasts were already rolling on the highway before I got to see how the fight started. I imagine the brown one must have come along and started it, as the gray one had been harassing me before the fight began. Was I witnessing a turf war between alphas of two different tribes? Or were these two battling for status within their shared tribe? In either case, I was a little too close to ringside for this battle of the century. I put the car in reverse, and I backed up about 30 or 40 feet, keeping the engine idling. I know I should have just backed the heck up and gotten off that road, but as frightened as I was, that's also how amazed I was by what I was seeing. I mean, this fight they were having was absolutely ridiculous. They were leaping over and under each other like some kind of martial arts experts, and yet, when they would attack, it was usually with their immense teeth, snapping away at the softer parts of the other. Never did either one of them stop to come up for air. It was all one continuous motion of dog-on-dog action. They growled and squealed, slammed each other around brutally, and yelped in pain the same way any other kind of canine would. It was a dog fight, to be sure, but it was also as fascinating as any other performance by gifted athletes at the top of their game. The thing is, this wasn't a game, and it was clear that either one of them would be quite happy if they were able to terminate the other one with extreme prejudice. I noticed that they both appeared to have legs more like a dog than like a Bigfoot, which surprised me at the time. They were balancing so much weight on two dog-like feet, and their front legs were quite like arms, hairy, scary monster arms ending in claws. But they didn't seem to use their hands as fists, and they only rarely attacked via the claws. They seemed to use them more for defense, and to set themselves up for making another attack with the teeth, usually for the throat or the soft underbelly region. To call the fight savage would be only the beginning. These two wanted to rip each other to pieces. I've never seen human beings as angry as those two big dogmen on that night in my headlights. So I had my fill of things when it started to get bloody. I realized that would be me next, and I turned around, looking to drive in reverse for a few hundred feet. I wanted a wide berth between me and those two creatures before I tried making a U-turn over the grass partitions to drive away. But seconds after I began this maneuver, one of the dogs let out a blood-curdling yelp, so loud that it hurt my ears. It was the brown one, and he had fear in his eyes as he raced away from the gray one, his tongue flapping in the breeze, running directly toward my car as the beast leaped onto my hood and then onto the roof and down the back. I opened my eyes, and there was the gray one, looking furious, racing on two legs directly toward my face. I screamed. and that Dogman leaped onto my car hood so hard that I bounced up and banged my head on the car roof. The Dogman bounced me 2 more times before running over my car and chasing the brown Dogman. As I watched, the brown one and the gray one both dropped to all fours and kept chasing each other. I was so stunned that it took me a few seconds to realize that this was my chance to get out of there. I put the car in drive, and drive is what I did. That was the end of the story for me. It's not like I was going to chase them and find out who won. The winner was me as far as I was concerned, because I was fine and my car could at least still drive. I have to say, I had to stop the car after a few miles and pull over to the side to be sick, but if that's the worst thing that happened because of this incident, I don't feel as though I have a right to complain. Of course, my worldview has been battered and rearranged. I never took stories of monsters seriously before. If the things I saw hadn't been so unforgivingly savage, and if it weren't so absolutely clear that they could have crushed me in a second, I don't think I'd take monsters seriously even still. This was not like Harry and the Hendersons. This was not a friendly woodland pal coming for a fun visit. This was hunger, and anger, and savagery, and death, all wrapped up in a lot of muscle and hair. And then, before you can even accept that he's real, he gets into a fight with another hairy monster Dogman. I mean, I might be crazy. I might not have really seen what I think I saw. If it was a dream or a hallucination, though, it was more real than any other dream I've ever had. Although the highway was very empty that night, I'm wondering if any other drivers caught sight of the rumble in Humble, Dogman versus Dogman, battle in Texas. Kathy Barrickman, executive producer, couldn't be cooler and couldn't be looser. We think she's great, and it's simple math. She's number 1, our EP Kath. Please join us in thanking our executive producer, Kathy Barrickman, for making this show possible. If you would like to become a Scary Stories executive producer like the inimitable Kathy Barrickman, and also get to watch our secret uncensored stories every Sunday night, just join our paid subscribers club at peterbernard.com, or click the join link under this or any of our videos. PQ Ribber will have more info at the end of this episode, but right now, it's time for our second scary Dogman story of the day. This one took place right near the Chestnut Ridge, and we call it The Werewolf of Wolf Run, West Virginia. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I've seen The Werewolf of Wolf Run, West Virginia. My sister saw it when we were kids, and I was jealous of her for years. She wasn't even interested in monsters as I've always been, so it seemed unfair that she would get to see this real-life werewolf. Actually, it was most likely a Dogman, as it was not wearing a stitch of clothing, either when my sister saw it 25 years ago, or when I saw it at the end of last year. Wolf Run is a tiny place in West Virginia, and my family never actually lived there. My sister was friends with a girl who went to the Baptist church over there, and sometimes my sister would go to church there with her friend. It was in the cemetery behind that church that she said she saw the Dogman, or the Werewolf of Wolf Run. What I mean to say is that she and her friend were in the cemetery looking at the grave markers, and they saw the Dogman watching them from the woods. It was scary, but they didn't run because the monster never left the wood line, and he was hundreds of feet away. So instead, they just stared back at it. According to my sister, the creature stood taller than our father, and he was 6'2". It had light-colored fur that failed to camouflage it under the dark tree cover. In fact, it made the creature easier to spot from a distance. It was not an albino, and the fur wasn't white, but it was a light brown sort of a shade, and the hair was very short all over. It had a big head and looked a lot like Scooby-Doo with giant tusk-like fangs. It stood on its hind legs and seemed to be holding onto a tree. She never saw it walk, so she wasn't certain that it could, on its hind legs, I mean. It might have walked on four legs and then propped itself up against the tree, but its body looked so human to her standing there like that both girls described it as a werewolf. They didn't act like they were lying, and they didn't tell anyone but family and close friends. I never doubted that she was telling the truth, and both girls had matching stories. It was many, many years afterward when I was driving through Wolf Run late one night. I have dreamed about this so many times since it happened, and my dream version takes place on Zion Drive with the church and cemetery within my view. In actuality, though, this event happened on the next road over, Route 50/1. As I was driving down the road in the darkness, something huge came barreling out of the woods on the hill heading up to the church and the graveyard. I double freaked, yelling and turning my wheel and accidentally stomping on the gas instead of the brake. Wait, I guess that would be a triple freak, come to think of it. It seems a little funny in retrospect, but I thought it was a zombie coming to get me from the cemetery. That's a weird thing to think when something runs out in front of your car, but that is what I thought, and man, was I absolutely terrified about it. In the next few seconds, I found the brake, slammed on it, and found myself going into a mad spin-out. I mean, I was spinning over and over and over again while still generally moving forward and toward the thing that wasn't a zombie. Briefly, over and over, I saw the thing there, and I noticed that it was much larger than any zombie in any movie or TV show that I'd ever seen, and a lot hairier, too. I could see that it was a giant wolf, very darkly colored, but shining in the moonlight, and I could see that I was about to hit into his front legs with the side of my out-of-control vehicle. At the last second, the big dog did something I hadn't expected. He stood up. He stood upright, lifting those two front legs up off the ground and out of my way. I was momentarily elated that I was not going to be crashing into a giant wolf, but in the next second, the car skidded into a deep, wet puddle, and the engine conked out. I had been shaken up a little, but when I looked out of the window of the car, and I saw the wolf thing walking toward me on his hind legs, I woke up pretty quickly, and I started to get to work on restarting the engine. It did not start on the first try, and I got to listen to the sound of dog nails on the asphalt walking over to me. I did not stare, I did not even look, but I saw in my side vision that the Dogman had no trouble at all walking upright like that. He seemed quite at home, in fact. I was already tearing up as the engine started, and the Dogman leaned over to look in the driver's side window at me curiously. It even tilted its head sideways in that cute way that dogs do. I was not saying "aw" at that moment, though. Putting the car in drive and hitting the gas only produced a flying stream of mud and water flying out behind the car. That was a deep puddle, and the sound I had just generated with these actions had set the Dogman off. It barked at me loudly, or more properly, it seemed to be barking at the car. I think it was offended by the screaming engine and the stream of muddy water, and who can blame the beast? I threw it in reverse, and the Dogman actually leaped backward in surprise. I don't know what surprised it. I suppose just that the car moved at all. I was out of the puddle, but still had to maneuver back onto the highway, which was not easy to do. I had the Dogman barking at me and snapping at the car. For the most part, he seemed as scared of my car as I was of him, but every time he barked, I jumped. Every time he snapped at me with his teeth, I felt myself lose a year of my life from the intense fear. I knew intellectually that the dog was probably not going to be able to break in and hurt me, but he was still banging on the car and barking and growling and flashing his fangs, and I was quite literally shaking all over. Even after I maneuvered around it and floored the engine, the big dog chased me. It ran on 2 legs at first, then dropped to all 4s. Mostly, it stayed about a car length behind, but when I upped it over 60, the thing actually pulled up beside my window, barking at me. I couldn't believe any kind of animal could run 60 miles an hour, and even this one couldn't do it for long. It eventually fell back, and I've never seen it again. Obviously, because of the coloring, it could not have been the same animal my sister saw a quarter of a century ago. But it was the same kind of animal, of that I feel certain. And the name by which my family calls that monster is the Werewolf of Wolf Run, West Virginia.
Thanks for watching,
Dogman versus Alligator. Dear Scary Stories NYC. This is a story about a sighting I had 2 summers ago in Youngblood, Alabama. I was taking a day off for my mental health and wandering through nature. I came upon Youngblood Creek there in the woods, and I thought I saw an overturned rowboat floating along. Moving closer to get myself a better look, I saw that it was not a boat at all, but a real-life alligator. Something about the situation caused me to decide to remain quiet. For some reason, I didn't want to give away my position, but I wanted to observe this alligator swimming for as long as I could. While not really that uncommon, I personally had never seen an alligator up around Youngblood before. I saw some down south when I was younger, but not up here. So when I watched it swimming along with just its top exposed to the air, I was pretty interested. You might say I was drinking it in. The eyes on that gator reminded me of Godzilla from the old 1960s and 1970s films. Not so much the more recent Godzilla films, but the way the eyes stuck up on top of its head really resembled the old school rubber suits they used to use in the old movies. The alligator really looked to me like something that could have existed in basically the same form millions of years ago. I imagined that I actually was back in time, and yet nothing had changed. The creek still flowed slowly, and the gator still swam there in the murky, unclear water. Suddenly, that brownish, dirty water erupted in white foam in all directions. I nearly cried out in surprise, but I caught myself and remained silent, trying to understand what was going on in that water. The alligator was flipping around wildly, thrashing with every part of its body. At first, I couldn't understand why the gator would be doing this, but then I noticed dark, colored, shiny, wet appendages wrapped around its midsection from below. Something in that water was grabbing it. Something that apparently had what looked very much like human arms. I took a few steps closer to the water to see better, but I tried to remain quiet, as something still told me I better not give away my presence there. By this point, the gator and the other figure were rolling over each other in the water and crashing in a clumsy manner into the opposite shore of the creek. My first impression was that the gator was wrestling with a very tall man in a black skin diving suit. The longer I stared, though, as they wrestled on the beach, the more the wet skin diving suit seemed to resemble wet dog fur getting caked with sand. Somehow, both creatures ended standing up bipedally, wrestling with each other. I think the dark-furred monster man was standing under his own power, and that he had lifted the gator up with him as he stood. In that brief moment, I saw something so horrible that I forgot my decision to remain quiet. I saw something so terrible to see that I screamed incoherently and uncontrollably. I turned and ran, so I only saw this briefly, as I said. But what I saw was that the hairy man had a dog or wolf-like head. It sort of resembled some of the werewolves you see in the more modern horror movies. It was like a man for the most part, but it was a dog at the same time somehow. It looked evil, but I was seeing it in the middle of a battle. Still, I felt that it was evil and I ran. I never looked behind. I don't know if I was followed. I just know that I ran. When I got home, I told my wife what I'd seen. Believe it or not, she ignored what I said about the Dogman, and she told me that she didn't believe we would have gators living near us in Youngblood. It's just too far north. Like, that was the part she found unbelievable? I'm certain that what I saw was an alligator, though. The snout seemed kind of long and narrow for a gator, but that's what it had to be. We don't get crocodiles this far north, that's for certain. But then again, we aren't supposed to get werewolves around here either. I still felt freaked out from the entire thing, and my wife found the story boring, so I started calling up my friends to tell them. I soon regretted that, as they all wanted me to take them there and show them. They wanted to see either one, the Dogman or the gator. They did talk me into going back the next day, but by then we couldn't find anything of interest in the area. Still, nobody doubted me because they could see how uncomfortable and frightened I was just to be there, even with all of them. I tell you, I look at the wilds of Alabama a lot differently since the day that I saw Dogman versus Alligator. The Dogman of New Jersey, or the Large Dogs area. Dear Scary Stories NYC. Around a 40-minute drive outside of New York City, there is a place called South Orange, New Jersey. That's where I grew up, and where some of my family still lives. I love South Orange, and most of what I have to say about it is positive. There was one horrifying day I spent there, though, about 2 decades ago, and I know that's the only day of my life that you're going to be interested in. Why? Because that was the day when I got chased out of a public park in South Orange by the Dogman of New Jersey. Back when 9/11 happened, I lost a brother and inherited his dog, who we can call Fido. He was one of those Marmaduke dogs, really giant, and man, could he eat a lot. One evening I brought him out to the dog run, and we had a terrifying encounter with the Dogman. At South Mountain Dog Park, they have a special large dog area. There have always been people there with their oversized pooches each time I went. I was friendly acquaintances with most of the people, and Fido played with their dogs. On that one evening in 2002, though, we got there later than usual, and the clouds were gathering for rain. I was surprised to find the place completely empty, but decided to let Fido have some exercise anyway, so I tossed his toy around and let him chase after it. One time, he just missed, and it bounced off his nose in the direction of the chain-link fence separating the dog run from the nearby forest. Something past the fence caught my eye, and I became distracted for a while. I could swear I saw a person out there. That seemed kinda creepy to me, a person lurking past the dog run. What kind of guy does that for kicks? After not seeing anything else move for a while, we returned to playing, but I kept my eye over there, watching peripherally. If it was an illusion, it should still repeat itself so that I could understand what I had seen. Nothing seemed to be moving out there any longer, so we began playing a little faster and wilder. I wanted Fido to get to race around a bit, otherwise He was never going to let me get to sleep that night. Once again, a similar thing happened as before when the toy bounced off the jumping dog's nose and bounced over by the chain link fence. Fido bounded over there playfully, then froze, a foot in front of the fence, staring beyond it at something I couldn't see. The hair on the dog's back rose, and its tail went between its legs as it turned, frightened, and ran back toward me, leaving its play toy there. I knelt down to catch him, but he ran right past me and all the way back to my car, whining in fear, shaking all over like he had palsy or something. I couldn't believe what I was seeing, and I looked back at that chain link fence just in time to see a very tall, hair-covered, naked man grab my dog's play toy and leap over the chain link fence almost silently. I shouted at him to stop, and he turned around and growled at me. It was some kind of a dog mixed with a bear. It walked like a bear on its hind legs, but it was thin like a dog and incredibly athletic. The way it leaped that chain link fence would have won it the gold in the Olympics. My dog was right to fear this thing. I hadn't even seen it come over the fence toward us, and now I was watching it recede into the trees past the large dog area. I ran away from it as well. The skies opened up into a major lightning storm as we drove home, and poor Fido was a nervous wreck for that entire night. I was afraid that he would never want to go back to the dog run, but each time we returned, there were other people and dogs there, and he was fine with it. For the rest of his life, Fido and I only ever ran into the four-legged kind of canine when we would visit the large dog area. The Dogwood Park Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC. When I was in my early 20s, I dated a girl who was as mischievous as I was in those days. We used to like to do weird things like go to old cemeteries in the middle of the night and tell each other scary stories to see who would get freaked out first. A mutual friend had told us there was a really old, abandoned, spooky cemetery off in the woods north of the campgrounds in the Kisatchie National Forest. We decided to go camping and planned on sneaking out into the dark woods at some point after midnight to see if we could locate this old cemetery and see if it was really there. Now, as I'm putting this email together for you, I'm looking at an online map, and I see they do indicate a cemetery in those woods. It even has a name. They call it the Old Bellwood Cemetery. You see, I never actually saw it with my own two eyes because, well, I'll get to that part when I get to it. The name of the little road that both the campground and the nearby ranger station are on is Dogwood Park Road, but I don't know if there's actually a park around there called Dogwood Park. To my knowledge, it's the Kisatchie National Forest, but maybe they used to call it Dogwood Park a long time ago or something. At any rate, my girlfriend and I were calling it Dogman Park Road between ourselves as a joke or something even as we drove in. We both were monster fans, although I'm not 100% sure if we believed in them, or if we just thought TV shows about monsters were, less boring than other TV shows of that era. I don't remember being very afraid of Bigfoot or aliens as we would sit in old cemeteries, but sometimes I would get scared at the idea of certain kinds of ghosts or zombies or vampires maybe. I guess that was the kind of thing I was scared of when I dated that girl. So, the first time we tried to head off to the cemetery, this busybody lady who's also camping there shouted loudly at us that we were heading in the wrong direction. She got louder and more frantic, till it became obvious she was a real jerk, and she was going to cause trouble for us if we continued on into those trees past the end of the campground. She was shouting that it was dangerous, but she was also shouting things about it being illegal. I could tell she was one of those people who has nothing to do but cause trouble for everyone else, so we retreated back to our camp. We took turns standing watch, until the creepy old bat seemed to finally have fallen asleep. I think it was 2 or 3 in the morning by then. We were tired, and we were annoyed, but we were finally getting to do what we came there to do. I remember us both feeling excited as we tiptoed out of the campground and off into the vegetation, flashlights in our hands. My girlfriend stopped being as playful as usual when we entered the tree cover. I could tell something was wrong by the way she was acting and the expression on her face. Finally, I asked her what was up, and she asked me if I was serious. "Don't you smell that?" she asked. Nope, I couldn't. Smell what? She was convinced that she was smelling wet dog. After a while, I thought I could start to smell it too, but I wasn't sure if it was just because of her suggestion. I mean, it certainly wasn't the strongest or the worst wet dog smell I'd ever endured. I figured it was because it was humid out, and we were in the forest. Everything is constantly dying, rotting, and coming back to life in the woods. The rotting part can get smelly. She told me I was right, but her face said she didn't think she was just smelling the dampness. I had brought white handkerchiefs with me to tie to tree branches. I would tie a new one within eyesight of the last one each time, so I would have a visual guide to get us back out of there once we were done with our evening of fun. We walked and walked, but we weren't finding tombstones, and I started to think we should be heading back. I only had 2 handkerchiefs left to tie to branches. My girlfriend was over this as well. We were both ready to call it a night and head back to camp. As we turned around, though, we were both more than a little surprised to see a very large bear-like figure blocking our way. At first, all I could see was its shape. Then my girlfriend shone her flashlight on it, and it recoiled from the light, making a growling sound more like a dog than like a bear. Everything I was seeing in her flashlight looked more canine than ursine to me. Were we really seeing a Dogman so close to what we had jokingly referred to as Dogman Park Road? It had never been a funny joke, and now it was becoming truly sad. We were staring into the glowing eyes of this 7 or 8 foot tall linebacker kind of a dog bear man. It didn't like us staring at him, and he began to bark at us, walking quickly in our direction on his massive hind legs. I took off running, screaming in terror. My girlfriend did as well, but I found that out later. We both tore into the woods, heading away from our camp, but also away from that Dogman. We ran blindly and crazily, not having any idea where we were going. After a few minutes of exhausting racing over and under Flora in the dark and falling on my face multiple times, I heard my girlfriend weeping nearby, and the 2 of us reconnected. I held her, and she let it out while I tried to listen for the Dogman. When she was together enough to start walking again, I suggested we walk in the direction we presumed to be east. If we trekked in that direction for around an hour, I felt certain we would run into that road on the other side there. This map I'm looking at says the road is called FR 336. I'll take their word for it. She agreed, and off we went, not really knowing what way we were going, and not knowing if we would walk right back into that Dogman all over again. We did have cell phones back then, I think, and maybe they had texting on them, but they didn't have GPS, I'm certain of that. I doubt we would have had a signal out there anyway. So, while we thought we were walking east, we somehow were actually walking northwest, I guess. One way or another, we ended up walking back to Route 117. Once we knew where we were, it was easy to get back to our camp. I think we slept until 4 in the afternoon that next day. We had been up late, but the fear that we might not make it back was far more tiring than that. We never did get to see that old graveyard because we ran headfirst into the Dogwood Park Dogman. Thanks, Biggie, and thanks to all of you for watching this far. If you liked it, please click like. If you'd like to see more of our work, please subscribe. And also click that bell icon if you'd like to be notified when we put out a new episode. To become an executive producer, you can donate to us through the thanks button under each of our videos or through our paypal.me/PeterBernard209 page. To receive cool perks like secret uncensored Dogman episodes far too wild to ever run on this channel, you can become a YouTube channel member by clicking the join button. Or join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com. Joining either at the $3 a month level or above gets you access to our over 25 hours of secret uncensored Dogman stories available nowhere else. Do you have a scary story about Dogman or some other kind of high strangeness that happened to you? Let us know by emailing us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com or by leaving us a voicemail message at 804-LA-SCARY. You may need to call back on that one. It cuts off after, I think, 3 minutes. And if you don't want to do any of that stuff, thank you for simply watching to the end. Good night, and have a scary tomorrow.
Come back for more scary stories.